Randy, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mark Dawiziak. Mark's the author or editor of about 25 books, including 3 studies of landmark television series, The Columbo File, a casebook, The Night Stalker Companion, and Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, his lighthearted tribute to Rod Serling's celebrated anthology series. An internationally recognized Mark Twain scholar, his acclaimed books about the author include Mark My Words, Mark Twain on Writing, Horton Foote's The Shape of the River, the lost teleplay about Mark Twain in Ohio, Mark Twain's Guide to Diet, Exercise, Beauty, Fashion, Investment, Romance, Health, and Happiness, and Mark Twain for Cat Lovers, which was published in 2016. He has portrayed Mark Twain on stage for more than 40 years. No less an authority than Ken Burns has said, nobody gets Mark Twain the way Mark Dawiziak does. Born in New York, Dawiziak spent 43 years as a television, film, and theater critic at such newspapers as the Akron Beacon Journal and the Cleveland Plain Dealer. He is also the author of the 1994 horror novel featuring reporter Carl Kolchak, Grave Secrets, as well as such nonfiction books as The Barter Theater Story, Love Made Visible, The Bedside Bathtub and Armchair Companion to Dracula, and most recently, The Shawshank Redemption revealed how one story keeps hope alive. He is also the author of 3 volumes of work by Richard Matheson. Written with Paul J. Bauer, the literary biography Jim Tully, American writer, Irish rover, Hollywood brawler, was published in 2011 by Kent State University Press. It is the first biography of hobo writer Jim Tully, a forgotten author hailed as America's Gorky and a literary superstar in the 1920s and 30s. In 2002, Dawiziak and his wife, actress Sarah Shulman, founded the largely literary theater company dedicated to promoting literature, literacy, and live theater. Their repertoire includes works by Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe. Please give a warm Rotary welcome to Mark Dawiziak.
That's weird. You can't hear the applause. You can just see it. That's wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. Yes, and as Will said, I have been playing Mark Twain since 1979 on stage. I was 22 when I first started playing Mark Twain, and it took me 2 hours to look like this. You know, basically, I did not know that this was makeup by prophecy, that I was actually showing myself exactly what I was going to look like when I was 64 years old. So there has been a ongoing interest in both Mark Twain and Rod Serling. So let me see if I can get this technically right and get the share screen and the PowerPoint going. I do this talk both ways, but you know, I generally do not use PowerPoint because I like talking to people and looking at people and all that, except that when we do this virtually, this after a while it becomes this like Wizard of Oz thing where it's just a disembodied head. It's so to sort of get something to look at here, let's see if this works. Let's see if this works here. Hey, okay, we should be there. Okay, everybody is looking at the title card for Moralists in Disguise, Mark Twain and Rod Serling. So here we go. Excuse me. Toss the name Mark Twain at someone, and the image that comes to mind is probably that of a fellow in a white suit with a drooping mustache and an unruly mop of flowing white hair. Now, submit Rod Serling's name for consideration, and the image that probably comes to mind is one of a clean-shaven fellow with neatly trimmed dark hair, dressed in a fashionable black suit. Obviously, these two distinctly American writers are as different as black and white, right? You think of how Mark Twain addressed an audience, and you can almost hear the pronounced Missouri drawl he exaggerated for comic effect while on stage. You think of how Rod Serling spoke to us. And, well, you don't have to imagine it. You don't have to imagine it because you can easily recall those famously clipped tones with which he introduced each episode of his beloved anthology series, The Twilight Zone. Twain wrote for newspapers and magazines in the 19th century. Serling wrote for television and movies in the 20th century. Twain guided us down the Mississippi River, out to the still Wild West, and back to King Arthur's court with his Connecticut Yankee. Serling charted slightly different boundaries, a fifth dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. So what could the author of Huckleberry Finn possibly have in common with the proprietor of that wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination? Well, one of the great lessons of the Twilight Zone was not to go on appearances, that things are not always as they seem. And if I do my job this afternoon, you'll discover that although they were born 90 years apart, Mark Twain and Rod Serling share a great deal of creative and spiritual DNA. That's the signpost up ahead. Your next stop, the many intriguing personal and professional parallels between these two distinctly American writers. Now, let me start this journey by saying it was the writing of this book, everything I need to know I learned in the Twilight Zone, that brought these points of comparisons into sharp focus for me. You see, one thing that Mark Twain and Rod Serling have in common is that they are both heroes of mine. And the more I learned about each of them, the more heroic they became. Now let's dwell for just a second on that word, hero. Let me tell you a little bit about how I fell under the spell of these two heroic writers. When I was a youngster, my idea of a hero was someone who carried a gun. Well, of course, that was how I thought. The movies and television shows of the 1960s and 70s had provided me with an endless parade of heroic figures who invariably saved the day by relying on a granite, hard, square jaw, a wicked right cross, and deadly accuracy with a firearm. They were everywhere. Private detectives, secret agents, cowboys, soldiers, and police officers, even the science fiction heroes of the time, arrived on the scene with a futuristic firearm of some kind, whether we called it a phaser or a blaster. And by the time I started college, I certainly realized that many people we ask to carry guns are indeed heroes. I happen to be related to several of them. But during those high school years, I fell good and hard and forever under the spell of Mark Twain and Rod Serling, and I realized something, that a hero also could be someone who fought the good fight with words and ideas. Or, as Rod Serling put it, it has forever been thus. So long as men write what they think, then all of the other freedoms, all of them may remain intact. And it is then that writing becomes a weapon of truth, an article of faith, an act of courage. Now, I was just young enough to have missed the Twilight Zone during its original run, but a station in New York, WPIX, Channel 11, dear old WPIX, almost immediately started rerunning episodes of The Twilight Zone. And folks, I was hooked. The Twilight Zone was and has always and forever remained my favorite television show. But as a kid, I enjoyed The Twilight Zone the same way most of you first enjoyed it. For the creep out factor, for that delicious twist ending at the end that gave you that wonderfully eerie feeling. And as I watched these episodes as a teenager, something happened. I started to realize that behind all of the irony and the fun fantasy, each episode contained a moral, a life lesson, a parable, if you will. Each one was a parable using fantasy to deliver a timely message about the human and the all too often inhuman condition. And this was precisely the same time I was devouring all the works of Mark Twain, at least all the ones that I could get my hands on at the time. These were two writers that I would continue to carry with me throughout my entire life as I moved from state to state, but I still wasn't aware of how much they had in common. Here are just a few items, and forgive me for this, submitted for your approval. It's not quite a case of separated at birth, but the parallels are fascinating. Each was born in a town not destined to be cherished as his hometown. Samuel Langhorne Clemens was born in Florida, Missouri, or as he might have said it, I was born the 30th of November, 1835, in the almost invisible village of Florida, Missouri. The village contained 100 people, and I increased the population by 1%. It is more than many of the best men in history could have done for a town. It may not be modest in me to refer to this, but it is true. There is no record of a person doing as much, not even Shakespeare. But I did it for Florida, Missouri, and it shows I could have done it for any place, even London, I suppose. While he was born in Florida, when Sam was 4, the family moved about 35 miles east, still in Missouri, to a little town called Hannibal. And this was the town which he did consider his hometown. Hannibal, a little town clinging to the banks of the Mississippi River. Or as Twain once put it, I became quite fond of that river. I was regularly drowned in it every summer, and then fished out, drained out, pumped out, inflated, and then set going again by some chance enemy of the human race. I remember they asked my mother if she was worried about all of these close calls in the Mississippi River. And she just smiled and said, boys born to be hanged are safe in the water. So this is Hannibal. This is the hometown. Rod Serling was born on December 25th, 1924, in Syracuse, New York, later describing himself as the Christmas present that was delivered unwrapped. Before he was 2, the family moved about 70 miles to the south in upstate New York to Binghamton, which he did consider his hometown. Each viewed his childhood in a bit of a nostalgic haze, immortalizing his idealized hometown in landmark works that drew on cherished boyhood memories. Twain, of course, and Tom Sawyer, Serling in an episode of The Twilight Zone called Walking Distance, his beautifully crafted episode with Gig Young as a tired businessman who walks into his hometown and into his cherished past. By the way, Binghamton still celebrates Rod Serling as a favorite son. The park that was immortalized in Walking Distance was modeled on Recreation Park in Binghamton, which is still there. The carousel is still there, and there's a bandstand. And this park became Rod's favorite playground. He lived just a few blocks away. He could walk to the park very easily as a little boy. And now that park is almost a monument to Rod Serling. At the center of the bandstand is a gold plaque, which simply says Rod Serling, walking distance. There is also a carousel, and the carousel is decorated all around the top with scenes from the Twilight Zone. And if you are there in the summer months, you can ride the carousel free. You can ride that carousel as many times as you wish throughout those glorious summer months. And here are just some of the scenes from the Twilight Zone that are at the top of the carousel. Burgess Meredith, Cleveland native Burgess Meredith, In Time Enough at Last, and Rod himself with a picture of the bandstand in the background. Both Mark Twain and Rod Serling each had his career path as a writer decided by a cataclysmic war, albeit in radically different ways. If it weren't for the Civil War, Sam Clemens very likely would have never become Mark Twain. By 1861, Sam had achieved his dream of becoming a riverboat pilot on the mighty Mississippi River. And he expected to follow that river. In his words, I expected to follow the river for the rest of my days, dying at the wheel when my mission was ended. But the war put an end to commerce on the river. I had to find a new profession. I joined the Confederacy, trained for 2 weeks, deserted, and the Confederacy fell. I could have been a soldier if I wanted to. I had half of it down. I knew more about retreating than the man who invented it. Now, Twain is indulging in a bit of exaggeration here. He did not join the Confederacy. He liked to say later on that he had, it sounded more romantic. He actually joined a ragtag home guard unit, a group of his friends, boys from his town. They went out into the woods and played soldier for a couple weeks and then immediately dispersed when they had rumor of a Union patrol in the area. And they were scared to death that they were going to encounter the patrol because at the head was a headstrong officer whose name was Ulysses S. Grant. And Twain later would become very good friends with Grant. He would help Grant's family survive bankruptcy by publishing Grant's memoirs. And he would often joke with Grant that it was a good thing they did not encounter themselves because Sam would have ended his military career had they encountered themselves at that point. So what does Twain do? Because of the Civil War, he decides to get out. He decides to leave. Now, Missouri was a border state. It had sympathies that went both ways. And in fact, the Clemens family itself was split. Twain's mother, Jane Lambton Clemens, was hot for the Confederacy. Twain's brother, Orion, pronounced Orion, was a sympathizer for the North, and he actually campaigned for Lincoln. And because of his effectiveness as a campaigner, he was rewarded by being named the secretary to the new Nevada Territory. So he's heading to Nevada on the overland stage. Sam goes along as a kind of secretary to the secretary, but he really just wants to travel. He just wants to travel, and he heads west, searching for a new direction in life. He goes west on the overland stage, and he arrives in Virginia City, which is the heart of the bonanza time, the silver mining boom. And he thinks he's going to get rich as a silver miner. Or as he put it, I struck a disappointment there. I expected to find the silver just lying around on the streets where I could pick it up and shove it in my pocket. I found that you had to dig it out of a mountain with a long-handled shovel. And I had no use for a long-handled shovel. Oh, I didn't mind if other people used a long-handled shovel. I'd even stand along the side and shout encouragement. But Twain himself is a failure as a silver miner. But he does find his fortune in Virginia City. Sick of silver mining, he walks into the offices of the Territorial Enterprise, the local newspaper, and volunteers his services. And it is here in 1863, for the first time, he uses the pen name Mark Twain. He discovers gold, all right, but he discovers it at the tip of a pen and not in the mountains of Virginia City and later California. So the Civil War puts Mark Twain on the path of becoming a writer. What about Rod Serling? He enlists in the Army in early 1943. As soon as he graduated high school, he heads down to the recruiting office and he talks himself into the 11th Airborne Division's 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He is going to be a paratrooper, even though he is only 5'4" and weighed only 118 pounds. How he ever talked himself into this job? He's almost underage. He's just 18. He's definitely underweight and he's definitely undersized. And yet he has this incredible personality and he talks himself into doing a very, very dangerous job in a very, very dangerous place. He is sent to the South Pacific and he becomes a paratrooper, one of the people whose job is to parachute into the islands before the expeditionary forces and clear the way for the retaking of islands in the South Pacific. He is injured several times and he gets out of the war profoundly wounded, both physically and psychologically, and he's not sure what he wants to do. So when after the war, he decides to enroll at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And he thinks about being a physical education major because he likes working with kids. But it is here in Antioch he discovers writing as a way of working through his experiences in World War II. And by the way, this is why we claim Rod Serling. He becomes a writer here in Ohio. That's what makes Ohio holy ground. This is why we claim Rod Serling, because the epiphany is here. This is where he decides to become a writer, and it's where his early years as a writer in Cincinnati are spent. So without the Civil War, we do not get Mark Twain. In fact, Mark Twain does not even become Mark Twain. And without World War II, Rod Serling does not become a writer. Each would write powerful works probing the costs of war and indicting the human penchant for slaughter. Twain would write, "Man is the only animal that deals in the atrocity of atrocities, war. He's the only one that gathers his brethren about him and goes forth in cold blood and compulse to exterminate his own kind. He's the only animal that for sordid wages will march out and help to slaughter strangers of his own species who have done him no harm and with whom he has no quarrel. And in the intervals between campaigns, he washes the blood off his hands and works for the universal brotherhood of man with his mouth." Compare that to something that Rod Serling told students during his 1968 Binghamton Central High School commencement address. "Keep in mind only this, that the promise of combat is not the end. It is simply the means. And the most essential part of that challenge is for you to find another means that does not come with the killing of your fellow man." Each penned scathing indictments of the human race's capacity for cruelty and ignorance. Each lived in Cincinnati before achieving fame. Twain as a tramp printer setting type before becoming a riverboat pilot. Serling as a young writer working for Cincinnati and Cincinnati TV and radio stations. And again, this is where we make a genuine claim on Rod Serling. He spent 6 of his adult years from 1946 to 1953 in Ohio, which in a lifespan that only spans 50 years on this planet is not inconsiderable. But more importantly, again, this is where he became a writer. Each lived in Connecticut after making his name as a writer. Each had his first big national breakthrough around the same age. Twain at 29 with his celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County story. And Serling at 30 when his TV drama Patterns was aired by Kraft Television in 1955. Each was drawn to the spotlight and enjoyed being recognized. In short, each was a bit of a ham who enjoyed playing a public version of himself to audiences. Each reveled in the affection of admirers. You rather think that Serling would have agreed with a conclusion Twain reached near the end of his life. Praise is well, compliment is well, but affection, that is the last and final and most precious reward that any man can win, whether by character or achievement. Twain and Serling won it by character and achievement. Each was the best known writer on the planet at the height of his fame. And folks, there is no close second choice. Each was a genuine 14-carat celebrity. And don't gloss over that one, because this is a rare feat for writers who tend to be anonymous. True celebrity is a status few writers actually attain. Twain was one of the most recognized people around the world. He was called the most conspicuous person on the planet. There was once a letter sent to Mark Twain, and it was addressed simply, Mark Twain, somewhere in the world. It got to him. It was delivered. And thanks to television, Rod Serling was the most recognized writer of his generation. During the 1960s and 70s, people who could not pick Norman Mailer or Saul Bellow out of a Police lineup knew Rod Serling. They knew the voice, the face, the mannerisms. It was even possible that they could do a quick impression of him. Each was invariably caricatured or photographed smoking. Twain, with his cherished cigar, he smoked about 40 of them a day. And he lived to be 74, which is not a bad run for somebody who was smoking 40 cigars a day. Serling, of course, with the ever-present cigarette. In truth, each was a chain smoker. Each emphasized his distinctive speech patterns for effect and for public consumption, but neither actually spoke that way when not performing, as their families and friends made quite clear. No, Rod Serling did not talk like that away from the camera. And Twain always said that he exaggerated what his mother called Sammy's long talk when he was on the platform. In other words, he exaggerated the long drawl, but it would have been a much quicker tempo in real life. Each saw nothing wrong in being popular and commercially successful. Herb Brodkin, a television producer, was once asked for a quote to be used in a profile of Rod Serling. He said, Rod is either going to stay commercial or become a discerning artist, but not both. When asked about this observation, Serling said, I presume Herb means that inherently you cannot be commercial and artistic. You cannot be commercial in quality. You cannot be commercial concurrent with having a preoccupation with the level of storytelling that you want to achieve. And this I have to reject. I don't think calling something commercial tags it with a kind of odious suggestion that it stinks, that it's something raunchy to be ashamed of. If you say commercial means to be publicly acceptable, what's wrong in that? In those words, you hear the echo of Twain's famous declaration, my books are only water, and those of the great geniuses are wine. But just remember this, everybody drinks water. Each had the same view of the writer's role. We'll let Rod Serling handle this one. He must have a position, a point of view. He must see the arts as a vehicle of social criticism, and he must focus on the issues of his time. Each enjoyed spending summers with their families at beloved upstate New York retreats. Twain at his sister-in-law's Quarry Farm in Elmira, New York. And this is Quarry Farm. This was the farmhouse where he would spend his summers. His sister-in-law, Susan Crane, built him a little octagonal study, which was away from the house, where it's where he actually did most of his writing. The family lived in Hartford during most of the year, but Hartford was social. They were constantly entertaining, and he got very little writing done in Hartford. He got most of the writing on the great books, Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, Life on the Mississippi, here at Quarry Farm in that little octagonal study. And the study was built and patterned after the pilot's house on a riverboat on the Mississippi River. Serling every summer would pack up his family and head to Lake Cayuga in a cottage north of Ithaca. Although separated by all those years geographically, if you look at a map and look at Ithaca and look at Elmira, that's pretty tight grouping. Each was a doting and devoted father to adoring daughters, loving to invent stories for them every night. Each died of a heart attack. Well, Serling died of a heart attack and probably would have anyway. Twain died at 74, even after 40 cigars a day in 1910. So that's a pretty impressive run. Serling died at 50 in 1975. And yes, the cigarettes could not have helped. But Serling probably also inherited a bad heart. His own father died of a heart attack at 52 while Rod was serving in the South Pacific during World War II. So it may have happened anyway. Each was survived by a daughter who wrote an insightful memoir about it. Clara Clemens published My Father, Mark Twain in 1931, and Serling published As I Knew Him, My Dad, Rod Serling in 2013. And by the way, I cannot recommend this book enough. If you want to know the real Rod Serling, the impish guy with a great sense of humor, the guy who liked being the life of a party, the guy who liked to imitate a gorilla, the guy who did make up stories for his daughters, you can only find him in this amazing, wonderful book. So for anyone, those of you who have not read Anne's book, do seek it out. It's the closest any of us will ever get to know the real Rod Serling. Now, Rod Serling once said, I just want them to remember me 100 years from now. I don't care that they're not able to quote a single line that I've written, but just that they can say, oh, he was a writer. That's sufficiently an honored position for me. 50 years from now, they will still remember Rod Serling was a writer, and they will remember a good deal more. They will remember the writing. It will live. Why? Well, here we go. But not right to the Twilight Zone, but back to Mark Twain and the most profound connection of all between these two American writers. Even after the publication of such books as Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, Mark Twain was widely viewed by many as a humorous and a genial family author. One young French admirer, a little girl named Helene Picard, noticed something more blended into the writing and behind all of the laughter. And she said so in a 1902 letter to the writer. Twain read the letter and basically sent back one of his own, telling this perceptive little girl, "Shh, you've got it, but don't tell anybody. You are right. Yes, you're right," he wrote to little Helene. "I am a moralist in disguise." What a marvelous description of Rod Serling, stamped by the Twilight Zone as primarily a purveyor of eerie tales with spaceships and supernatural beings, aliens and angels, ghosts on the phone and gremlins on the wing. But humor and fantasy in all of its many forms frequently are treated dismissively in literary discussions, but they are both powerful metaphoric tools for addressing the human and inhuman condition. They are incredibly sly storytelling devices for an incredibly dangerous undertaking, telling people the truth about themselves. George Bernard Shaw once thanked Mark Twain for teaching him the primary lesson when it comes to social criticism. If you're going to tell people the truth about themselves, you'd better make them laugh or they'll kill you. You can do this with humor and you can do this with fantasy, but you have to lure the unsuspecting reader or viewers into dropping their guard, leaving them wide open for the moral, the message, or the lesson. So what Mark Twain did with humor, Rod Serling did with fantasy. It was a conscious and deliberate choice and an extremely sly strategy. You see, when Mark Twain was emerging, when Rod Serling was emerging as one of TV's angry young writers in the early 50s, the medium was still the Wild West. They were making it up as they went along, and then so they were making up the rules as they went along. But by the end of the 1950s, TV had become nothing but rules. You can't say this because the sponsor won't like it. You can't say that because some stations will get upset. And getting the message across was getting tougher and tougher. So Rod Serling fled into the Twilight Zone, reasoning that he could address the same exact themes and no one would care if it was surrounded by aliens, spaceships, and angelic visitors. And guess what? He was absolutely right. There is a moment in an interview Serling did with Mike Wallace right before the Twilight Zone was set to premiere. And it's an amazing interview. It's on YouTube if you want to seek it out. They're both sitting there smoking like stacks. And Mike Wallace, in his typically snarky Mike Wallace way, looks at Rod Serling at one point and says, "Well, Rod, you're doing this thing called the Twilight Zone. I guess we can all assume you're done with serious writing." And the camera sort of zooms in on Rod, who has this smile on his face. But the magician cannot give away his trick. He knows he's about to pull off the greatest trick of his career. But what does he say to Mike Wallace? "Yes, Mike, you're right. I'm done with serious writing for a while." And then he goes on and does his most important contribution to television history and the American culture. He launches the Twilight Zone and he goes right ahead and he explores war and prejudice and bigotry and nobody raises an eyebrow. So, Mark Twain died in April of 1910. 50 years later, they still knew he was a writer, a great American writer. More than 100 years after his death, we still know he was a writer, and we still know the writing. For so many similar reasons, the same will be true of this other moralist in disguise. If you want further proof of this, consider the test suggested by another American literary giant, Walt Whitman. In his preface to Leaves of Grass, Whitman decreed that the proof of a poet is that his country absorbs him as affectionately as he has absorbed it. Can you imagine a better summary of Rod Serling's legacy? Serling absorbed the American experience in all of its complexities with the fervor of a patriot, the conscience of a reformer, and the soul of a storyteller. And America returned the favor. Look around you. In any given week, you will see multiple references to the Twilight Zone in everything from opinion columns and political cartoons to news reports and television scripts. There is no pause to explain what the Twilight Zone is. The expectation is that you know and fully grasp the significance of that title. You have absorbed it. That's why you know what it means when someone says, I'm having a real Twilight Zone moment here. That's why people know what you mean when you say it. And when you take it all right back down home, it comes to this. You'd be a better person if you took to heart the principles at work in the Twilight Zone. It would be a better world if we all lived according to the rules and precepts of the Twilight Zone. Perhaps that's because Rod Serling so deeply believed in that better world. Best of all, the object lesson was camouflaged by a magical sense of wonder. The storytelling was so delectable in the Twilight Zone, you didn't even notice the taste of medicine. One of the few TV shows that continues to jump generation to generation, it remains seductively entertaining fun. The balance between escapism and morality is what keeps Serling in the Twilight Zone alive. Mark Twain observed, humor must not professedly teach, and it must not professedly preach, but it must do both if it would live forever. The same could be said of fantasy and its close literary cousins, horror and science fiction. Let's return for 1 second to the notion of the Twilight Zone jumping from generation to generation, because that's important. Since the spring of 2009, I've been teaching at Kent State University. And every few months, I notice that more and more movies and television shows slip out of the pop culture consciousness. With very few exceptions, my students no longer recognize stars and titles that were basic rites of passage for previous generations. They don't know the Marx Brothers. They don't know Humphrey Bogart. They do not know W.C. Fields or Laurel and Hardy. On the television front, they don't know the Honeymooners. And folks, it hurts to say this, the Andy Griffith Show. This is the first generation that has not lived in Mayberry or called Mayberry its hometown. Most of my students have a built-in resistance to anything in black and white. So there are only 2 black and white series that keep making the jump, even as so many others are left by the pop culture roadside. And the 2 are I Love Lucy and the Twilight Zone. And if you want proof for casual evidence, ask my students. I get to test this theory on a semi-annual basis. My students no longer know bus driver Ralph Cramden, deputy Barney Fife, or comedy writer Rob Petrie, but they still have spent time with the Ricardos and in Serling's middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition. The resistance to black and white is there, yet the Twilight Zone breaks down the resistance. The magic worked then, and it works now. And as the Twilight Zone jumps from generation to generation, so do the morality plays. The lessons get reinforced and a millennial in 2021 finds them every bit as compelling and relevant as a baby boomer did in 1959. It's something you discover about Rod Serling's writing before, during, and after the Twilight Zone. Turns out he was right. It truly is as timeless as infinity. Some writers seem dated because of themes and settings. Some seem dated because of style and vernacular. Very few remain of their time, yet timeless. Very few leave behind stories that speak to us today as forcefully as they did when they were first written. Very few transcend errors and fashions, and Rod Serling is in that select company. It's another parallel with Mark Twain, who so often seems to be talking about the 21st century rather than the 19th. The lessons first penned for the Twilight Zone during the Eisenhower administration were valuable to generations that didn't know an internet, home computers, or smartphones. They're valuable today. And they'll be valuable when we're colonizing Mars and wary of aliens dropping by with cookbooks. You unlock this door with the key of imagination, Rod Serling told us. You can't depend on your judgment when your imagination is out of focus, the earlier moralist in disguise, Mark Twain, advised. Do not part with your illusions. When they are gone, you may still exist, but you have ceased to live. May you never run short on that kind of magic in all of your lives. It is our big, tall wish for you from the Twilight Zone, from Rod Serling, and from Mark Twain. Thanks for listening. And if you have questions, I'll stick around.
Mark, we have a custom in our club that one of our members responds to the program, and today that's going to be Mary Beth Harper.
Thank you, Mark. We really enjoyed hearing about your heroes, and what you did for us is you gave us news stories with a moral, a life lesson, and a timely message. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you.
All right.